Hi, and welcome to the Rig Doctor podcast, where I'm giving out remedies to soothe the ailing tone of your sick pedal boards so that you can have tone just like the pros. I'm your host, Mason Marangella, aka the Rig Doctor, and I've been building rigs for decades for many of the industry's top professionals. And now I got a podcast where I'm giving away some of my best tricks, tips, and ideas to DIYers just like you. And today I'm bringing in my buddy Michael Nielsen to help promote some of the best gear around that can get you some of the 80s and 90s rack era tones in a pedal format. We go through all of the stuff that he's got, which is all the classics, all the staples of the 80s and 90s rack era. And then we talk about pedals that can really approximate those tones so that you're able to sort of dip your toe in the deep end of the pool of the rack tones without having to spend a bunch of money and without having to transport a refrigerator around to bring those sounds with you. So without further delay, let's get to Michael Nielsen. Let's talk about rack tones. He's going to demonstrate some of these for us. We're going to talk about a lot of gear stuff. It's going to be a blast. Let's do it. All right. So I'm here with Michael Nielsen with an S-E-N.
Nielsen. It's always wrong my entire life.
Well, I'm guessing that it's like a Nordic spelling, right? That's like more like a Swedish or
I have a Danish dad and a Puerto Rican mom.
Wow. Okay. So then you got the benefits of like gefilte fish on like one end and or pickled herring as it's known in the Nordic countries, and like mofongo.
Yes, exactly. It's an interesting combination. It works for some people. My wife says it works.
Right.
Some days.
Well, here you are. So the reason that I wanted to talk with you is that, first of all, you have a great YouTube channel, and I think
Thank you.
it's like one of those YouTube channels that I feel like is under people's radar and is like just primed for like a huge jump in momentum at any point, just because I think that the information is like really cool, and I think that I like people that are providing access and also like analysis behind that of sort of iconic pieces of gear. And I feel like you do a really great job of like synthesizing what it is that you're hearing in a context that sort of transcends like the average person, or is like able to reach like the average person or somebody that, you know, is really high tech with their gear. And so really what I want to talk to you about today is about maybe some of these pieces of gear, these iconic pieces, because you got a lot of them and you've demonstrated a lot of them, you know, like the staple pieces of the 80s and 90s guitar studio scene. You certainly have videos that represent a lot of that and cover a lot of that ground. But I really want to talk about like where you feel like the pedals sort of bridge that gap, because you know it's always a challenge when either they're being adapted from an analog to a digital sort of device, or they're being adapted with parts that don't necessarily exist now, and people are trying to kind of bridge that gap, or they're taking something that maybe they're redoing the hardware in a more sophisticated, instead of a 16-bit it's now 24-bit, and maybe they spend a little less attention on the analog side of these, which I think is really the magic of a lot of those rack units, is like the stuff that happened before it got turned into a digital signal, or when it got brought back into an analog signal. And that's kind of where a lot of the newer companies, I think, are maybe sleeping a little bit, is that they're relying on their processing power and less on the things that sort of insulate that. But that's my long-winded way of sort of kicking us off. But for people that are not aware of your channel and kind of what you do, how would you sort of describe the channel, the Big Hairy Guitars?
Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate it, Mason. And I should start by saying I love your channel, too. I've watched the Corey Wong video where you put together his pedal board like 10 times, like from beginning to end. It's one of my favorite things on YouTube.
He's the most animated man, like in or one of the most animated guys in the industry, I would say.
Totally.
So he's fun to watch.
Yeah, and that was just so interesting to see his take on the duct tape pedal board, like, and then it turning into something beautiful that you created. That was really fun to see. So I started this because I wanted a reason to play guitar. I'm a composer, and I do movie trailers and video games and stuff, but I had a long stretch where I didn't play, I'd play guitar 10 minutes where I added one part to a cue, and then that was it for the month. And I wanted a reason to buy stuff, and even a reason just to like learn an entire song top to bottom. So I thought, well, like I'll just do some like recreation stuff. And one of my early videos was a Zakk Wylde recreation video. And then I realized like you get copyright strikes also. So it's like, well, I still need a reason to do this. So I'm sort of a composer, sort of an engineer, producer, and I would say guitar player last. So the gear I'm really passionate about the gear, and those sounds from the 80s and 90s and 2000s are really like my sweet spot. Like Echoplexes are sweet, they're great, and vibes and univibes, and so that's all fantastic, but when it goes digital, that's where I'm like, yeah, I love that big, like you listen to when Trevor Rabin showed up in Yes, that's like the difference. Like Yes before, people go, yeah, that was the real Yes. It's crunchy and like gritty and earthy, which is all fantastic. But when it went 3D and it goes fully like Star Wars, that's what I'm super into. And so yeah, it was just, I had a nice stretch where outboard gear was fairly inexpensive, and I could, get an ADA MP1 for like $150, and it was semi falling apart, but it was good enough. And my PCM 70 sometimes will randomly switch patches in the middle of just switch to something random, but it's, it's fine. I'm not out gigging with that stuff. That's where if I was to gig, this is not what I would take at all. I would go pedals or, like an Axe-Fax or something like that.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's a perfect jumping off point for kind of or encapsulates the ideas here is that like all this gear is great, but how can we reasonably sort of reinterpret it, and I think that you're in sort of a really unique position where you've played a lot of this stuff. And certainly in the professional context, I sort of like, had, when I first figured out who you were, I kind of looked at what it was that you were into. And it's interesting that you characterize yourself as a guitar player last, because most people that are doing compositions, they're like not really even guitar players. They're usually like, they're competent on a piano or maybe multiple instruments. They're rarely ever guitar players. So presumably you have to, know a lot about music, I would think. Did you go to like a music school, or how did you learn how to get into composing?
Was the School of Hard Knocks. I mean, it was, I went to UCLA for history. I met a guy there, and we started like a 2-man band, but we both had the same vision. It was like, I remember this conversation we had, which is like, yeah, I love rock stuff, but I also love pop. And you gotta, like at the time, pop was Bobby Brown. So he's like, but, pop to me is like Toto and like Rush and Yes. It was like, you're my guy. It's like that Step Brothers scene where it's like, best friends.
Yeah, but you probably weren't that popular when you went to a frat party.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know what? So he was the best drummer, and I was the best guitar player in this little circle. So guys were pushing us together. It's like there was gravity. Like, you guys got to get together. So that guy, who was a very close friend of mine for a long time, he wanted to be a composer, and he ended up becoming a big composer. His name's Brian Tyler. He done just Marvel movies and endless huge stuff. I didn't really want to do that. I just wanted to do studio stuff. So I took this crazy journey of being a pop producer for a while. Like I did singles for like Baha Men and Selena Gomez and like just a whole bunch of random stuff, and at some point landed as a composer. I'm sorry, Mason. I don't even remember what your question was.
I think you're getting there. The scenic route's cool. I think it was really just about how you kind of landed into this, because typically guitar players are not people that end up being composers.
Oh, yes, thank you.
You don't see Hans Zimmer's not shredding, or
right. So, my music as a hitting the radio was not killing it, but it was getting licensed into TV shows and movies. So I got pulled over to this movie side, and then it was like, oh, cool, you want to write something orchestral? Yeah, sure. No idea I didn't know the difference between a French horn and a trombone. But I had no choice. I had to figure it out really quick.
Right.
But at that time, it was like, okay, can you spell a G minor 7 chord? Like, no, I could play it on a guitar. So it was a lot of like really fast learning. I'm still really dumb on guitar. And I say that with love. Like, you don't have to know music theory to be a musician or to enjoy guitar. When I sit at the keyboard and write, my brain goes to a different place. When I pick up guitar, it goes bleh, and just turns into like shapes, and I turn back to when I'm 15 and I'm like, cool, A minor pentatonic, let's do this. Let's go.
Right. Well, they're I guess they're sort of they're utilizing sort of different skills, like probably there's not really many that opportunities to really shred on, a thing that you're composing.
Oh, shred for sure. That was one of the weird transitions coming out of sort of my college era, which was a lot of thinking of like, Lukather and Landau, maybe Dream Theater. These guys are the most incredible musicians, to like, that's not cool. That's not what people want to hear right now. They want to hear like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and they're great musicians in their own way, but I had to unlearn how to play guitar. I had to loosen it all up, and like all the tightness had to go away. And then for a while, I couldn't go back the other direction. So now that it paid off. So it's like, if you want to do something Jack Whitey, my technique completely changes, and like I pick upside down, and it's just a way of getting that sound. Or you could do something tight Trevor Rabin-y, and everything changes for that. But I had to release what I was so passionate about. Like, I want to be Steve Lukather, or I want to be Michael Landau, and just go, okay, what does this piece of music call for? It's not about me wanting to be metal shredder guy, because I've been asked to put one solo on something maybe in the past 15 years. And I think at one point, I think it ended up just being, that when you'd have to do the that unison bend, and you bend up to the note and just and the solo ended up just being for, I don't know, 8 bars or something like that.
Right. Well, I mean, sometimes that's what they need. Well, in television, or if you're doing like commercials and stuff like that, they're certainly not trying to appeal to guitar players in particular. Yeah. They're trying to use the sounds as sort of I don't know, to reinforce imagery and things like that. It's kind of a different thing. But it's interesting that you said that you kind of faked your way through it, because the only other guy that I know really well, not that we know each other really well, but a guy that I know really well that does this sort of thing is Snuffy Walden. Mm-hmm. And Snuffy had, told me that when he accepted the Wonder Years job, or I think that was like his first big gig, he had no idea how to score or do any of this stuff. It just totally lied, and just said that he could do it. And figured it out. It worked out well for him, but I think I wonder if you were to, get everybody in a room that's kind of like doing this sort of stuff, and they were really being honest about their abilities when they first got their big call or whatever it was. That I wonder how many of them really felt like they were competent across the board on all those things.
Yeah, I think every job is super scary. Of like, I don't know how to do this. And those end up being like the really fun jobs because you're like, oh, I figured it out. But I don't know, man. Snuffy is a really good musician, so...
Yeah, he is. He is. He thinks of like really simple things that are so catchy, you know, like the Friday Night Lights theme or the Wonder Years theme, you know, with the acoustic guitar. He told me he didn't even own an acoustic guitar. Wow. He had to like go borrow one, you know, because he was like coming from like these rock and roll bands and stuff like that, and he was playing with Shaka Khan and, you know.
Wow. Because I think of him as an acoustic guitar player first.
Yeah. Have you ever heard his stuff from like the 70s?
Nope.
He was in this British, like even though he's from Texas, he like couldn't get a record deal in the U.S., so he moved to England, and he was in this band called Stray Dogs, or Stray Dog. I can't remember if it's plural. But if you hear it, it's like really rock and roll. Like,
oh.
Yeah.
I'll look for that. Oh, if you have a link, send me something. Yeah,
I'll send it to you. It's good. It's good. And he actually has like a documentary that was made about him recently, and I think it was at Sundance, and it's called Up to Snuff.
Okay.
And it kind of like documents his sort of ride. But bringing it back to gear, because we took a little detour.
Yeah, sorry.
No.
At the end of the day, and the coffee, I'm gonna spin.
This is okay. So I think that the first thing like that you said about how kind of like your kind of jumping off point is kind of at the era where, you know, you use the you know, like yes is sort of the example of like this transition from, you know, when it was like clearly like this more analog, like old school way of doing things, and then there was this the switch flipped, and now it's like, you know, experimenting with digital processing and things like that. If we're talking to somebody, let's say, that's listening to this, and I think that this is probably the baseline for a lot of them, that are not familiar with kind of like the key like food groups from the sort of the rack era, how would, you know, the Michael Nielsen holy trinity of tone, what would you sort of place as kind of the primaries, as like the key pieces of gear that kind of defined maybe those generations that were sort of ubiquitous in racks, that you had to have these sorts of pieces in order to kind of call yourself a studio musician?
Right. Well, I think it's, in terms of the timing and era, it's like a 1984, 83 to about 10 years to 93, 94. That sort of zone. So it started with, as the actual studios had reverbs and chambers, and they started shrinking down, and they would use that, and they had more tracks available to them, they would process the tracks specifically, as opposed to like the Beatles, where everyone gets the same chamber or something like that, and that's all you got.
Right.
Right. So you get acts that want to take that sound with them to recreate it, and these guys were taking these abominations, these giant, you know, they have their heads, and then they have to wheel in, it's like a mobile refrigerator, and then some other thing on top of it, bring your toaster oven, a TV, a VCR. That's kind of what they look like, those early setups. It's terrible, with like some milk crates and on top of bricks. And then Bob Bradshaw came along and sort of revolutionized that, consolidating. And there was a couple guys in that mix as well, but Bob's the first one that I'm really aware of that really it took off. So it's taking the studio with you, essentially, and to try and recreate that sound. It starts with the amps, because guys that were taking 3 or 4 amps, they want to have their clean, their crunch, their lead. That had to get shrunk down into something like a preamp, which is taking an amplifier and splitting it into 2 sections. The power section on one side, and then the gain and tone shaping on the other side. And now you could have sort of 3 of the tone shaping going into 1 of the power section. That's preamp and power amp in a nutshell. I'm going to start this so I could point closer, because I have sort of examples of this over here.
Right. And just for people that are listening to this digitally and not viewing it, we're going to go into some exemplars of some of these kind of core tones.
Okay, so I think this is set up dry right now, or not at all. The old have you tried plugging it in trick?
Right. Step one.
Okay. And then turn off your tuner. There we go.
We know if we're taking it back to like the 90s, remember the Unplugged series was pretty popular for a while.
Yes. Yes, I would have. This is how it started. Like, we can't get a tone. Okay, so I have set up over here is a little mini rack, essentially. Right, right now I'm using a Mesobarba preamp, which is a 3-channel preamp. That became sort of... for the high-end thing, 3 channels was the staple of clean, crunch, and a lead. This is great because you could switch from the front panel. A lot of the old original, like the Soldanos or the Wagner Fish, you need a custom switching sort of system. So this is super great. With one punch, you could jump over. So I've got my
Is this
clean.
trying to approximate like a custom audio preamp, or is this kind of just like their own thing?
It's its own thing. It's sort of like the Soldano and Marshall world, but it's very amp-like. So I mean, I think that's where it took the guys a minute to figure out how to make this split combination sound like amps. Right. They had a different kind of thing, and sometimes you listen, you're like, that's a weird 80s tone where the distortion is sort of detached from that beefy Marshall thing that people were getting 5 years before that, you know, where it starts getting almost hi-fi. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of the later guys have figured that out. This is one they've got it dialed, but it can do these kind of 80s vibes too, which is really nice. Like, so that's a, you know, super clean. Crunch. And then our higher gain side over there. So in the studio, compressors are one of the big 2 effects. The EQ and compression, a lot of people have heard, like, get your drums sounding good, you need EQ and compression. So the same kind of thing goes with guitars. If you were recording to tape has a compression that is really nice and kind of holds some of these wild dynamics back. Higher gain sounds are naturally compressed, so they also kind of hold a nice dynamic and will keep you in the mix with the drummer, bass player, and singer. The clean tones, they jump wildly. And unless your technique is really, really on, your volume's going to be all over the place. So the compressor takes all of your level, your highs and lows, and just gets them all into a tight package where you could turn them up or down. So the 80s rack compressor was the DBX 160, this is the A. There's also an X. There's a couple of models, but I mean, DBX makes the chip, so if they have DBX compressors in pedals, in rack gear, all kinds, everywhere, you know. So that holds down your dynamics. And you can see the gain compression going. And it just kind of makes you a better guitar player. Like, not always, but, you know, often. It just kind of tightens everything up nicely.
Now, do you think that they use that in addition to the Rockman on Def Leppard?
No, that Rockman is so compressed. It can't get more compressed.
It's so amazing that like Mutt Lange would just be like, "All right, Rockman," you know, like of all the with all of his prestige, you know, that's sort of been the thing.
So a quick aside, I was lucky enough when I was doing one of my pop gigs to do it in the Bahamas at Compass Point Studios with Terry Manning, who had recorded, I think, Led Zeppelin 2 and ZZ Top, and like he was asked to take over to record Def Leppard after Mutt left, and he was like, I don't want to touch that. That's one of those gigs you can't win. You know, it's Mutt or nothing. But he was telling me how Mutt, when they were trying to get the guitar tone for Hysteria, they went back because they had recorded, I think it was the Back in Black album at the same studio that Terry was at Compass Point, and they took the Angus amps, set it up in the same room, and they're like, this will be this. Nope, that's not. They jumped through every possible hoop to find the guitar tone on Hysteria, and that's, I think they were probably at the end of the line and just like, I don't know, what's that thing? Let's plug in the rock. Sure, try a Rockman.
Yeah.
And no one knew. Oh, yeah. You do? Do you have?
I have the same. Yeah, like the same one.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
They modded it for the album because on the Rockmans you could choose delay or chorus.
Yeah.
But you can't have both off.
No, it always has two. You have like a choice of two running all the time. Two things.
Yeah,
running.
So they modded it so that it went dry.
Okay.
So, you got skills. You could add a little switch there.
Yeah, I never I mean, it's so fragile, I actually thought about putting it on a pedal board because there's no controls other than just like on or off for like the chorus. It's just like you don't have a control over the intensity or anything like that. So I thought about like you could just stash it like under a pedal board, and just like have it in a loop and, go crazy when you want to go crazy. You just have your Def Leppard tones.
The soundscape will go from here to like Rockman, and then back out.
Well, and you can run them stereo out, so you can get a little bit more space with them if you want. It's certainly I know what you mean though. It's kind of a bandwidth.
Yeah, it's
killer.
A narrow. Yeah. Sound. The band has to be right for that.
Right.
Everything works for that.
Yeah, and I don't know what they used like on what was the album? I guess was the one before was the first Mutt Lange album, wasn't it?
Yeah. No. I think he also did High and Dry.
Okay.
And then Pyromania.
Yeah, because
Photograph.
I don't think Photograph was a Rockman though, was it?
No. I think that's AC/DC style, just Marshalls and stuff still.
I have that ISO track. I'll send it to you if you want to hear it. Yeah,
I'd love to. I'd love to.
Yeah,
that's
it's
awesome.
Good. It's good.
All right, back to some rack goo and stuff.
All right. So far, just to recap, we had the preamp and the power amp disaggregated, separated. We had the DBX compressor.
Yes. And I'm cheating here. I'm running my preamp into a 2 Notes Cab M, which I have one of my own cabs that I make for them that is set up with the power amp emulation in there. So my power amp has a terribly noisy fan. It's like someone's running a car in the control room. So this is the way to kind of get around it.
Got it.
And it still sounds really good. So, the next thing that the guys would look for, the guys and gals, but the 80s guitar players, was to add some sort of stereo-ness, because everything was so stereo-y back then. And so it was chorus was a big one, and dudes had been using chorus before with like the was it Boss or Roland that made the CE1?
Well, it was both, but it was a Boss product.
Okay, so that the big like huge brick.
Yeah, it was basically just like the jazz chorus section that was like in a pedal format.
Oh,
essentially.
Is it? Oh.
Yeah, it's very similar.
So chorus existed, and then it got digitaled, essentially.
Right, it's way more hi-fi than the CE1. Did go to like a tri-stereo or a 1210 or something.
Yes, and then Eventide came out with their pitch shifting units, and people figured out that you could pitch up a little bit on one side and pitch down a little on the other, and it creates a chorusing effect without the swirling going on, essentially. And they dubbed that the micro pitch shift. So that's what I have up here. And that effect stayed around. I mean, it's always, you'll hear it on Eddie Van Halen's guitar for the mid 80s on, for the rest of everything.
And most of the David Foster productions through the mid 2000s, because Michael Thompson still used that for all the clean tones.
Yeah. And then you'll hear it on, like, if you go to like Limp Bizkit,
really,
the lead vocal is buried in it.
Really?
Yeah, he almost sounds like a robot. When you listen back, you're like, oh man, that's that sound. But every lead vocal, whether it's Celine Dion or whatever, had a touch of it, because it makes everything sound just big. Even now, guys are, they'll be sliding it in just a touch to stereoize stuff.
Man,
a little bit.
I haven't thought about Limp Bizkit in a while.
I know. It came on the radio and I was like, listen to all that harmonizer. That's amazing. So let me show you what that sounds like. Where did my sound go again? So we're dry with compressor. And then as I eat this in, back to totally dry. And then here's about 50%.
And are you using any sort of mixer for this, or are you just running them in series in this thing?
This is all in series. I'm using kind of internal mixing here. If I was to set up a permanent rack, I would use a blend.
Right. So you just have them all at 100% wet, and then you'd use the mixer to bring them in. Yeah.
And it's a better way to go, because you'll get an independent feed. You'll get your amp sound hitting your chorus, and that's that effect. Then the dry amp sound will hit your delays, and that's that effect. As opposed to running in series, you're going to have chorus hitting your delay, and then delay hitting your reverb, adding reverb onto your chorus.
Or you could, some of those guys, I guess, were strategic in how they did it. Like, in some of those Bradshaw ones, he would put two in one mix that would feed another mix, So he would do kind of like a combination of series and parallel. I don't know if you've seen those rack diagrams.
I have. They're hard for me to read.
Okay. Yeah, because like on a lot of those like Lukather rigs, by the time they were kind of going toward the 100% wet stuff, it would be like harmonizer and reverb would be in one mixer that would feed another mixer that just had delays.
Well, I think having set this up, I feel like someone like Lukather could pull that off pretty well, whereas someone maybe like more in the studio trying to be a chameleon and not just like, Lukather has arrived in the studio, give me Lukather.
Right.
Someone else, you really have to, you want to be able to shift the order around and go like the Eventide will do a million different effects. Sometimes I would like it to be before the TC.
Right.
Sometimes I want it to be after, depending on what you're doing. And at least if they're independent, you're not getting, tainting the water there.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, basically, they were still independent. He would just have multiple mixers. You know what I mean? So like one mixer one would have an H3000 and a Lexicon reverb. That would be first mixer. Right? And then it would feed another mixer so that those effects would be affected by.
I see.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
So they were still, each thing was still mixable, but it was like one mix would feed a second mix.
And then it goes down the stream, and you have another. And if you need to adjust something, you go back to the earlier mixer.
Yeah, because he wanted, Bradshaw in particular, I guess, I agree with him on this. He never liked reverb last. He wanted reverb on the delay trail, so the reverb was always before. So, in all those rigs that I worked on of a lot of these studio guys in LA, the iconic rigs that everybody likes, that's how most of them were wired. They had the reverb before the delay, and the delay was last.
Oh, man. I have to rethink my whole universe here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so because a lot of them were using 2290s or the Boss, delays, which were written mono delays. So they'd have one, on each side to make it a stereo.
Right. Reverb first. Yeah.
So it was just reverb before delay. So the common way was H3000 or SPX90 with the Lexicon reverb. And then that mix would then in stereo feed the next mixer, the Rain, and that would have the two delays in it, TC 2290s or, later on maybe Lexicons, depending on the guy or their taste or whatever it was.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's really interesting how that worked in the consistency. And I'm sure he was probably advising people of the benefit of that. He's like, because you want to have those reverbs, you want to have the reverb on the delay trails, and that was, I think, his reason for feeding the parallel mix in series with another parallel mix.
Interesting. I'm going to have to mess with that.
Yeah.
Because live, I think the reverb is a little like, you don't need the reverb portion of it live.
Right.
Typically. Studio, yeah, you'll catch that a lot, but I'll have to give that a go.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So you got we're up to H3000.
Yeah, and that does everything. I mean, it's got great reverbs, great, but giant rack, spare no expense. All it does is micro pitch shift.
Right, and in most of those racks, that's all it was doing. So you could see the obvious benefit of guys that would choose an SPX 90 because it was so cheap, and it was kind of doing the same thing for that one effect.
Yep, and I don't really love the micro pitch shift on like dirt necessarily. Like it gets. I'm still compressing it. It gets really super fake. I would rather hear either just a touch of it or none of that.
Just get your Rockman.
Yeah, because it does that. It ends up giving you that super digital, larger than life thing, even though it's super digital.
Right.
All right, so let's turn that off, even though that's got some beautiful delays and reverbs and stuff. So the 2290 was marketed as a multi-effect, but really it's a delay. It's a mono delay with some sort of modulation in it. So the stereo part is just taking a mono delay and like move it over here, move it over there, move it over here. And now you could create a chorus, you could create a tremolo effect.
Yeah.
But it's a great sounding unit and easily adjustable on the fly. Some of them are really finicky, like the Lexicons. You have to kind of like either tap a million times and turn some knobs that are really finicky. The Rolands are pretty good, but if you're trying to just like speed through, you still have to dial. This has a huge touch keyboard.
Yeah.
You could dial in an exact BPM that you're looking for.
Yeah.
And then this is really cool too. Let me turn that guy on. Okay. So their tap tempo was called Learn. So you hit it once and it just starts racing upwards. You won't be able to see it, but it goes nutso up till the 1,000 milliseconds. And then you'll tap it again when you want it to stop. So dun, 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 dun. So that's your... That's the tap tempo. It was kind of maybe the first one I'm aware of that had that. What's really interesting about the sort of mono signal on the 2290 is they sort of phase shift them out. So your dry signal's here. Let me show you that. And that's up the center. And then the delay.
Yep.
Comes out in this weird psychoacoustic stereo out of phase, unless you just run it totally one cable mono. Then it sounds like a delay.
Right.
So, but this is an awesome delay. And what's interesting about it is it almost sounds like there's reverb and other stuff happening.
Right.
With just one delay effect.
Yeah, there's a lot of movement there for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are awesome.
Yeah, and then you throw your micro pitch back in there.
And it sounds like a Richard Marx record.
Yeah, you start to get there really quick. Really quick. It's not cheap to get there though.
Right.
Not these days.
So I think that's where some of these pedals come in. So
yes,
if we're kind of working backwards from kind of like where you started, like, you know, probably most people today are not buying, you know, rack units for their preamps to kind of start with. So like if somebody wanted to get into this and kind of start dipping their toe in, would you just tell people like get overdrive pedals and run them into a front of a clean amp, or would you say get a channel switching amp and then incorporate this sort of stuff in the effects loop? Or like what would you say is sort of maybe an archetype or two or sort of framework that somebody might be able to follow if they're kind of interested in going down this path a little bit?
I think one of the first questions you have to figure out is if stereo is important to you. When at home, it's impractical for me to run stereo. I have like just one speaker behind the sofa. I wouldn't notice the stereo anyway. And live, you really don't notice the stereo. You'll notice the stereo, but no one else cares.
Right.
It's probably more of an annoyance than anything else to everybody else trying to deal with your giant stereo awesome rig.
Right.
So if you're going to go like mono, you can still get all these tones and they'll still be lush and amazing. I think a compressor pedal is a good idea. You could set your amp clean and you've got your compressor where you could probably dial in even a quieter signal. You could get your guitar compressed and then set at the level exactly where you want to hit the amp to have the kind of clean sound you want. Mm-hmm. And then an overdrive. I mean, there's so many good like amp in a box overdrives.
Yeah, like what do you like? What do you like for like if you were going to say pedals that can do, you know, the clean tone in essence is just the compressor with a clean amp, right?
Yeah.
Have you found any DBX style compressor pedals? I guess is the first question that really nail it.
Yeah,
I have one, but I want to see if you know about it yet.
Exotic makes one that says it has a DBX chip, I believe. It's one of their minis. It was just so clean that I didn't love it because compression could kind of darken your signal.
Right.
And on pedals, that bothers me a lot. The way I'm running the DBX is after the preamp. So,
yeah. Which was common in almost all the rack rigs. It was always after the preamp.
Right, and you could compensate with things on your just tone knobs. It just, I don't know, that feels right. Sometimes the compressor pedals don't. So I always like to have a tone knob on mine. I go for the JHS, his orange tangerine thing.
Okay.
And that's gives me the same feeling, but it's an orange squeezer, I think, modified for his deal.
Right.
That feels like the DBX to me, but I don't think they're going about it in the same direction.
No. Yeah. Well, the one that I can tell you is using the same chips. It's the closest I found, not only in sound but in actual circuit, and it's a Keeley compressor that's like not his cool one that everybody likes. You know, it's like when Keeley made like a non-Keeley, you know, like 2-knob or 4-knob compressor, and I have it here on the wall. It's called the GC2.
Okay.
And it's a limiting compressor. So it's like not in the Keeley greatest hits. Not a lot of people use them. They're not that well known. It is as close to the original DBX 160 as I found in a pedal.
All right, I'm going on Reverb after when we're done.
They're not expensive. You can find them on Reverb like all day long for like 160 or so.
Oh,
like
I got
sub 200 for sure. They're great. It's really close.
Cool.
So that was clean. But then what about for like the first stage overdrive? Like, do you find that there's like a pedal through a clean amp that kind of gets, what the second channel of a custom audio would get, or what a Soldano X88 or something like that would get?
Like my favorite crunch is the Friedman small box pedal.
Okay.
It feels very ampy. It's very Marshall-y. That's what a lot of the guys in the Rack era were using Marshalls for their the second channel crunch tone.
Right.
And to me, that I could put it in a super clean amp and it becomes more than any of his other pedals. That one is the most amp-like into anything I've found. So that's sort of my channel 2. Yeah, that's my channel 2. Do you have a sort of crunch that you dig?
Yeah, so it's hard for me to put my finger on just one, because like the channel 3, like some of these pedals could border that. They could border a channel 3, because some of them have enough gain where they can almost get into like Soldano territory, which I think on the 3 Plus was kind of like what the the lead channel was kind of supposed to be, more of a Soldano type thing.
Yeah.
So I mean, one that's I think is pretty good is the JHS Angry Charlie is really good for a Marshall-y sound, and then their subsequent like Andy Timmons one is like that circuit with like another like a channel option.
Does it bother you with those pedals? Because I've had a Timmons that it's just a tone knob.
No, I don't think. I mean, I guess you could compensate with your amp, but I also have on a lot of the rigs, I have like an EQ too if I need to like compensate for it. But I think that's good. But I think that's a good point for people that maybe need the versatility. But there's another one that I saw you do a demo of, and this is kind of blurs that line. It's kind of got like a, I don't know, like a double consonant name to it that's kind of like high gain.
Is it the Sinvertech?
Yeah. So that I thought was actually pretty good, because somebody had turned me on to it that I knew, and it showed it to me, and I was like, wow, that sounds really good. I think it's the difficulty with that one is like you have to set it kind of one way. It's either going to be like the really high gain thing or a little bit less. But also, you know what, a straight up Marshall Governor is really good for those tones, and that has a 3-band EQ.
I have my original Marshall Governor from when I was a kid in the box right next to me, that I 6 months ago was like, oh, I should do a video on this, and I forgot it's in there. I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, those are amazing. And another one that's basically the same thing as that is the MI Audio Crunchbox. So the MI Audio Crunchbox is basically a Governor that's just a little bit more, like I guess they're not really boutique. MI Audio is kind of like, I don't know, somewhere like semi boutique, but not really expensive. I don't know how to categorize them, but that pedal sounds really good for that sound.
Check that out.
Yeah.
The Sinvertech, man, it's just the hardest name to pronounce for, I think, English, like native English speakers. I would put in the channel 3 zone.
Yeah. So you think it excels there? The other one that's sort of a weird one for me is the Sur Eclipse. Can kind of do channel 2 and 3. I don't know if you've messed with that pedal at all.
I haven't. I have the Riot, and the Riot does pretty dang close for that channel 3 thing. I don't like it for like chords necessarily, but if you're trying to do like a fat Lukather lead, it's pretty good.
Yeah. I think that the Eclipse is good. In the way they've set it up is really optimized for like if you're using a switcher or something like that, because you can change some parameters of it remotely through the switcher if you change channels. And so there's some things that could be cool about that for certain types of rigs. But those are kind of the honorable mentions there amongst kind of that channel 2. But I want to hear your channel 3 ones, other than, I mean, and maybe the Sinvertech one is not in that category of like ones that you would say,
so
this is in my top 3.
Sinvertech, the Riot, or I would probably go with a Rev, but the Rev I don't feel like are as dialed for leads as they are for like chunka.
Right.
So if I was going with a heavy channel 3 or like for a metal guy, but they do that amp in the box thing too.
Yeah. I kind of have, I guess I didn't consider them, but I do know that like that's kind of like where they really kind of land and identify kind of their branding is around those sort of sounds. So that totally makes sense. All right, I got a good one for channel 3 that is kind of Soldano-ish, if you think about it, is the MXR Eddie Van Halen overdrive. It's very scooped out, and it's got that kind of SLO-y thing to it, and a lot of people kind of, you know, crapped on it a little bit because it was like, God, another Van Halen pedal. But that thing, I did like I don't know if you saw it, but I'll send it to you if you haven't. I did a really quick demo where I took my version 1 PV5150 and I put it up against the pedal into a deluxe reverb, clean. And I think like 48% of the people guessed it right.
No way.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I recorded it with the same reverbs and all that stuff. And one was the pedal going into a deluxe reverb. And the other one was the actual Eddie Van Halen PV 5150, Mark 1.
Wow. So I found when I had that pedal that I had to dial my amp in an unusual way to make the pedal sound great. And then the pedal sounded amazing, but I couldn't turn it off.
What amp was it? What amp was it, though?
What are you using it with? I don't...
Because I feel like I agree with you if I use anything that's not Fendery. That's like straight up Fender. So like Hot Rod DeVille, fantastic. Deluxe Reverb, great. Hot Rod Deluxe, great. It sucks through my stuff that's already kind of a little bit like my JMP 50 back there, sucked. Plexi, or the Super Lead, it sucked. And so I found that it does great into clean, already really clean 6L6, 6V6 Fendery voiced amps really well. Because they're already kind of scooped out anyway, you know, and so it's sort of like exaggerating some of the stuff that it already does. And that mid-range on that Van Halen pedal is like useless. Like if you turn it all the way up, it feels like it's like 5% difference at its max from its minimum to me. Maybe I have hearing loss or brain damage or something, but that's what I was thinking like when I was playing it. But it really did that sound well, and in recorded, I used them both. I used the same cabinet on both because I have a 212 cabinet with G1265s, and so I put them both into that 8-ohm cabinet just so that wasn't a variable, and it was pretty close.
That's cool.
Yeah,
that's really cool.
Yeah,
it's funny how the cabinet and microphone too. I mean, that's a whole nother video of conversation.
Right.
It's like half of the tone is the cabinet and the microphone, and so when people sometimes write me and be like, your amp sounds good, or well, how did you make this amp sound good? And it's like, well, you put it into a good sounding cab, and you mic it right. It's gonna sound, you're halfway there.
Right. No, I mean that's your sort of your finishing EQ, you know, or it could be your starting EQ depending on your signal path.
Yeah.
It's incredibly important, and I think we've learned this the hard way. I used to have this show called Game of Tones, and we used to try to recreate classic recordings, like rock recordings, and then we would play them to like a blind group of experts to see if they could tell which was the fake and which was the original. But we only played the ISOs, so they didn't have the context, because we did that the first time we did it, and it was a disaster because you could tell from how it got engineered and mixed and mastered again that it didn't have the same polished, you know. We don't have the budget to hire somebody to do mastering for a YouTube video like that. But if you did the ISO'd stems for the ones that exist, that was where it was really hard to tell. But some guys were really difficult in that even if we could emulate their signal path, and this was a known and published thing, there's like so many variables that like are just impossible to really know. Like you could have everything right about the pedals and, you know, kind of the amp that they used and maybe how they would ordinarily set their amp to a degree, obviously tolerances permitting, and maybe even know their mics, you know, and stuff like that. And it's just like, it's still like, you still can't even really get that close. Even if you brought, you know, the same player in to play those parts, I think that, people would still have some idea, who are really deep fans that really knew all the inflections perfectly and any of the ghost harmonics and all that stuff. It's just like, I don't even know that Eddie would play the same thing twice, you know, or something like that.
The guitar gets processed so many times before it goes to the album.
Right.
It's like through the buses, through the console, out through the tape several times, and
right. Yeah, it's crazy. So I mean, it was sort of like a lesson of like, you know, you can't really get anybody to fully sound like, or you can't really recreate anything fully because there's just like, there's so many unknowns, you know. So anyway,
yeah.
So we got a couple of pedals now for the rack, and we're now moving on to modulation. In this case, micro pitch and/or tri-stereo chorus in combination with micro pitch. That would have usually been the last thing stereo split into the mixer. So what do you like for tri-stereo chorus and/or micro pitch?
I'm gonna say the name wrong. Neunebauer? New Neighbor?
New Neighbor, yep.
New Neighbor. And I forget what it's called, but he has a pedal that does a pretty cool tri-stereo chorus.
Yeah, I think it might be called like tri chorus.
And that one also has a mode that includes the micro pitch in it, so you kind of get everything in one pedal. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm looking at it right here. It's called the Inspire Tri Chorus.
Ah, right.
And it's talking about algorithms here. That's when it loses me. Yeah, okay, so I see that you can get tri-chorus and then you can add it with detune.
Yeah.
I see. Okay. Wow.
Which is just his micro pitch in there.
Right.
So that's pretty cool. And then the alternate is the Eventide H9.
H9. Have you compared the H9 to the new one that's just the pitch one that they released?
No, I haven't. I haven't got my hands on that yet.
Yeah, I'm curious of how, you know, if you just take the delay out of it, you know, how it would compare to just that setting alone for the H3000 micro pitch.
My guess is that it's a guess. It's identical. You know, the upside is if you want to get cool with knobs.
Right.
You know, the H9 is not set up for that, really.
Right. There are no knobs.
Yeah. You get what you get.
Yeah. Or you break out your iPad.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what about for, have you ever messed with the, there's a company, you've probably heard of Shiva. They were called Shiva. I don't know what they're called now. They changed their name.
Yeah. Italian company?
Yeah. And they had made a pedal version of a tri-stereo. Did you ever try that one?
No. I didn't know there was a pedal version of that.
It's mono, but it sounds pretty good. And another one that sounds pretty good is a Free the Tone Tri-Avatar, but it's a digital version like the New Neighbor. Mm-hmm. But I haven't tried the New Neighbor, and so I'll have to check that one out.
It's pretty good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
And then what about for delays, if we're talking about 2290-ish or Lexicon-ish?
I mean, I haven't found anything that does that PCM 4142 thing, which is funny because those are digital delays. So in theory, why don't you just put it in a digital delay in the pedal? But actually, it's right here. I'm going to see if I could get it without knocking everything over. I have this coming back. There we go.
Okay. It looks like a Free the Tone pedal.
Yep. This one.
Yeah, I have that one. The flight time.
Yes, so this is where, like, I love TC Electronic. They're like a legacy company, you know.
Right.
I know they have different ownership and stuff, but they're TC Electronic. So this says 2290 on it and sounds nothing like a 2290.
Yeah.
At all, in any way, shape, or form. And then this is mono, right? There's no other. Yeah, it's mono.
It's mono.
So it doesn't do that 2290 spread and all that other stuff. But as a delay, it sits the same way. It's like you could plug it to the front of an amp, and it sits better than any delay I've heard. Yeah,
and the other one that they did, I don't know if you've seen it, they call it the Future Factory, and it's sort of like an expanded version of that, but it is stereo.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, so that one's pretty cool too. But I ended up for my like pedal board, my rack bass pedal board, I just bought 2 of them. And did what a lot of guys ended up doing with 2290s if they really wanted stereo.
Yeah.
You know, where they just get 2 of them.
You've got to bite the bullet.
Right. Yeah, especially then. I mean, you know, because I think even when they were new, they were like $3,000 in the 80s.
Oof.
I think they were like 2,600, maybe 2,700. You know, so pretty close. That would have been a lot of money back then.
That's never been not a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, but like think about that in today's dollars. They'd be like buying, you know, I don't know, like ATC monitors or something like that. You know.
Right.
So yeah, those are cool. I'm trying to think of any other ones that I think are really good for that. Sorry, I just need to do a headphone. My hair was driving me crazy. Headphone adjustment. But you know which another one that's actually pretty good that I think sounds excellent is some of the Digitech stuff that was like Lukather used one of their delays for, I don't know if he's still using it, but he was using one for a while because all those engineers from Lexicon got bought up in that whole like Digitech Harman thing. DOD.
Yeah, that was that the hand-wired?
Yeah, the Hardwire. Hardwire was like a division of Digitech where they were like going with like true bypass, and I mean they were not particularly attractive pedal enclosures, but the reverb.
But they were solid too. They were metal.
Right. No, you could defend yourself with one of those if you needed to. But the reverbs were great. They had a reverb one called the was it the RV? I think it was like the RV7 or something like that. I think was what it was called. It was like a similar nomenclature to the Boss stuff. And that was amazing. Sounds incredible. The only problem with it for the rack thing is it didn't go 100% wet. But I figured out how to do it with an easy mod.
Oh, see that I had one of the delays and I sold it because it wouldn't go 100% wet.
Yeah, so the problem is, or at least, I mean, I guess you could wire it where it wouldn't do that. The way that I did it, it was like, it was always 100% wet. Like you couldn't change it back. It was just permanently 100% wet. But I guess that it could have been done on a switch. I guess I just never was going to use it like that, so I didn't think to do it. But those delays can also be modified to do that. And those have a very similar kind of vibe to those Lexicons. And a lot of the guys that were on that project to make the Hardwire stuff were all old Lexicon guys.
Mm.
And so they do have some of that essence. And even I've seen guys like Bradshaw talk about those. I mean, he liked those a lot. Not that he was like a guitar player, but I think he certainly has the ear of amazing guitar players to sort of validate that experience. So I think that those are...
he's heard some stuff, for sure.
What about for reverb? I mean, I know we didn't have one on here, but do you have any that you think are really special? I mean, you did that Chase Bliss Maris one recently.
Yeah.
Is that you think on par with this stuff, or do you feel like there's some other ones that are like maybe more or better value for what they provide, or is it like?
Yeah, I think the Chase Bliss is awesome, and it's worth what it's worth what they're charging. Like, yeah, it's expensive. It's $800-900, but it's really good, and it does cool stuff like faders and stuff. So you can't fault them for that. And there's 2 companies, so you got to eat.
Yeah.
So
got to feed the monkey.
Yeah. For reverb though, at a cheaper side, which is still amazing, I really like the Source Audio stuff. They have 2 pedals that have, one is a delay reverb and the other is
the
a dual reverb.
Yeah.
Yeah, the collider is the delay and reverb.
And then the Ventris is the dual.
Thanks. And the Ventris it's got 2 reverbs, so you could set like a room and then like a hall for the other side, which is really nice. So the guy that's their, I think, lead engineer over at Source Audio had designed some amazing effects processors for Kurzweil, the keyboard company. Mm-hmm. They had like it was called the Rumor and the KSP-8. These things were like rivaled Lexicon and TC, but it was Kurzweil. It was a keyboard company, so no one was trying to get
didn't have the same sex appeal. Yeah.
Yeah, but the guy knows what he's doing. Those boxes were amazing, and these pedals are really good.
I've been preaching the collider from the mountaintops because it's the easiest solution for people that actually want to try real wet dry, because you can run the delay and reverb in parallel at 100% wet. So it takes care of the mixer problem for you. You can run them in parallel at 100% wet, has analog dry through. And so you could literally, if you want to kind of dabble and not have to set up a whole rig, you can set up your ordinary guitar rig, run it straight into the amp, as you normally would, and then go out of the line out box and feed it into the input of your Source Audio collider, have your delay and reverb in parallel, mix them however you want. You can go stereo out of that into, a cab M or some other sort of cabinet simulation, and then have, a left and right balanced output to go back to your mixer. Because really, I think the thing that people, at least in the pedalboard side, overestimate is like, you don't really need to have 2 more cabs on stage if you're really playing live. Most of these guys are all in in-ears anyway, so I usually just have people put them into cab simulations for the wet, and then they can mix them in their in-ears, because they're probably not going to be able to have 3 cabinets on stage anyway. And, usually what you're really feeling behind you is the dry amp, and then you can mix your in-ears however it is that you want. And usually you want the wet to be pretty linear anyway. You don't want to have a bunch of speaker distortion on the wet. And I mean, you could adjust that, of course, with most of these simulations, but I mean, typically most of those guys like Landau and those Pacific 112s, they just had vintage 30s, wasn't anything really unusual,
Right.
And
I always think that too with just where you put the speaker simulation, like if you're doing it in the box. Right. And because a speaker simulation is pretty linear, even the best ones are pretty linear. I don't find like it matters that much to me whether the speaker simulator is after the effects or before the effects.
Yeah, and I think if you want to kind of keep it true to form, I guess you'd put the speaker simulation for the wet after if you were going to do it. But I think it's such an easy way. The cheapest one that I know of that's pretty good is the Cab Zeus. Have you ever messed with that guy?
No.
Because it's a stereo and so like with the Cab M, you'd have to get 2 of them, for each channel. This one is a little bit more simplified, and they only have a couple of different speaker choices, but the Vintage 30, of course, is on there. And then I think you have 2 mic choices, or you can use both. And so usually, for that stuff, I mean, most of those guys, if you look at all the old photos, they don't usually have like a crazy mic complement on their wet cabinets. They have like a 57 on one speaker on a 412, Right. So I usually just select the 57, I hard pan left and right, and then I can adjust, the mix for the left and right however I want in an in-ear or in my monitors or whatever. It sounds incredible. I mean, it sounds really great. And it's just 2 pieces, it's a speaker simulator and the collider, and so you don't have to get a parallel mixer and get all the 100% wet effects. It like eliminates so many moving parts. It's an easy way to do it, I think.
Yeah, that's awesome. To be honest, the rack thing is kind of a nightmare, and I know why it went away, because it's horrible to set it up. Like, you have all these like really high current devices that something's gonna buzz in there at some point. It's super heavy. They're super expensive. I mean, it sounds great, and none of the pedals do that sound exactly.
Right.
There is a thing after, growing up hearing the records from the 80s and 90s and early 2000s that used PCM 70s and Eventide H3000s and 2290s. Like, I'm pretty dialed into the sound, as is, I think, most of the people who grew up with that stuff.
Right.
So you could get close, maybe not exactly it, but if you're in a band or you're going to play live, that stuff goes away. That subtle texture goes away, and now you're that 0.5% or 1%.
Yeah.
It's about the overall tone and the playing.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those tones too were made in a vacuum, and so you you weren't hearing these records recorded after they took their rack rigs on a 180-day tour.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like it was pretty isolated for the time, and I mean a lot of those things weren't really made to move in a shock mounted rack everywhere. Like I was talking to Carlos Rios, who's kind of one of the session guys back in the early days, and had a Bradshaw rig. And, and he just said that, like, it had nothing to do with Bradshaw, but he said that, when they'd go to, like, another country or whatever, like, every time it would get, like, moved to a different continent, it would just, like, it couldn't endure that kind of abuse, And, I mean, presumably, even if it's being done by, the tour management and all that stuff, I mean, like, these things are getting, they're underneath planes. They're probably getting, 30 or 40 degree temperature fluctuations. They're getting banged around with other stuff. They're going thousands of miles. It's just like a H3000. I don't think that was in like the plan. I think that they thought when they designed, like, this is going to live in a mix bus. It's going to be sedentary, And so, I think the pedals in that way sort of overcome a lot of things. And the other thing I wanted to mention is when you look at all these signal paths, a lot of this, the wet, dry, wet stuff in particular, was all a function of that they wanted to run stereo rigs, and most of the gear that they were using in the studio was only return. It didn't have any dry, and so they were forced to use mixers and all that stuff with that. They didn't have an option to run, to mix in the clean signal if they wanted it. And they didn't have a way to really use that or integrate it with their amplifiers. And really what I think that they were trying to do, because if you look at those early wet dry rigs that Bradshaw was doing, and when he was just using like a big resistive load, or if they were using a speaker, it was just silent. So the dry cabinet wasn't even on the stage. They were just using it to mix back in the dry with the wet cabinets that were in stereo. Really, if they just had pedals and they had effects loops, really a rig that's a stereo rig with effects loops, basically a stereo effects loop rig, was pretty close to what they were trying to achieve, but the hardware just didn't exist that infrastructure didn't exist, and the hardware didn't exist to make that possible. So I think a lot of that, if they just had, effects loop Marshalls or multi-channel effects loop Marshalls with, not even 100% wet effects, just ordinary pedals that could do it, that would have been what they would have done. And I think a lot of this was just how they addressed what was available. And that was
plus the miniaturization of these things. Like, you couldn't get even a halfway decent digital reverb compared to a rack effect until recently. Right.
Yeah.
So and the delay times were tiny. So if you're trying to be super cool, if you're Steve Vai and you have songs that are based around delay or these timed delays, and you're switching on the fly, like, you could either have 17 delay pedals, one for each song, or you need to have them MIDI switchable, and it just made sense to have the same thing you used in the studio. But now you get infinite presets of whatever delays you want.
Yeah, and you got a switcher, and you got all those things that formerly you'd have to have this guy in North Hollywood make for you, and and he had a list of way more famous people than you for years.
Yeah, that always happens.
Right? Yeah, I mean it's great that all this stuff exists now, and you can get kind of versions of it, and that we can reminisce a little bit about some of those things and maybe how people can approximate it with what's out there now. So I'm appreciative to you, Michael, for maybe not all of these are so secret, but I think for people that are listening to this and they kind of again want to kind of dip their toe in and kind of figure it out, I think we gave them some good recommendations and synthesized some of the core elements and maybe how they could go about sort of building some of those pieces into the rig.
Awesome. That was super fun. And I would tell people, go listen to first 2 Richard Marx albums, go listen to a Toto album, and any Toto album, and like a Trevor Rabin Yes album, and like that'll dial in some of that real Rack stuff. If you're ever like, well, where can I hear all of the Rack stuff at once happening?
Right. Yeah, because you'll get Michael Landau, and you'll get because I think he was on both those Richard Marx.
Yeah,
albums.
I think he was seemed like he did arrangements because there were some really guitar centric things that were all him.
Yeah, and then what was the other one you said other than Yes? And
Toto.
Richard Marx? Toto. Okay, I'll hear Luke
Yes.
Guitar. Well, I guess in the really early like Toto 1, he wasn't using a rack.
Right. You got to start on like it gets worse before it gets better. with Toto. So after the Africa album, Toto 4, it goes and dips, but then it gets great around like Toto 7. Yeah. And that's Soldano, and that's when it's like the sweet spot, all that stuff was dialed in. Yeah. And he had the amp sound and the clarity. Yeah. Whereas they figured that out.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you. I think that those are some I'm okay with some of the bad ones as well.
Dude, yeah.
I mean, like I think that they sound great, and yeah, but I think from like a commercial standpoint, like you kind of have to be like a geek for those things. Like you find the greatness in the obscure maybe at that point. Yeah. Well, cool, Michael. It was great to speak with you. And if people want to learn more about what you're up to on YouTube and things like that, where's the best place to find you? Just type in
Big YouTube,
Hairy Guitars,
if you look for Big Hairy Guitars or Michael Nielsen, I'll show up. I think that's
with
probably
an E-N.
I'm around Facebook. I'm pretty easy to find.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks, Michael, again, and check out Michael's channel. It's very cool. He does a lot of cool demonstrations showing this stuff. He just did a recent one with Marshall Super Lead and sort of validated all the things I thought about mine and kind of breaking down some of the things that we maybe gear that we wouldn't ordinarily want to buy or afford, and we let Michael spend his hard-earned cash and
great
and figuring it out for us. So learn from his trials. So thanks a lot, Michael.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
What a cool conversation. Michael is one of the few people that I know that, is not only a great player, and his YouTube channel is actually really cool in that he sort of breaks down a lot of these classic pieces of gear. Clearly, he's got a great job, and he's able to afford some of these kind of really cool pieces of gear and is able to demonstrate them for people through his YouTube channel. I think it's just great because it sort of distills some of maybe the X factor about what made a lot of that gear really special and great. And then being able to make recommendations sort of based on that experience, I think is really important for, ordinary civilians that need to get those tones but don't want to carry around a rack and want to have the portability of pedals. And so I think this is really cool. In fact, I'm going to go check out the New Neighbor chorus that we talked about because I'm friends with Brian at New Neighbor. And I don't think I've ever tried that chorus. I've tried a lot of his other pedals, and I haven't tried that one. So I definitely want to go check it out and see what it's all about. And if it's got that D-tune option in there, that's already pretty cool. So that's going to be a fun little project for us to experiment with. But yeah, man, Michael is such a wealth of knowledge. I hope that we get to talk to him again in the future, maybe talking about more of the rack stuff or the wet, dry, wet rig. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there for us to reconnect. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did having it. If you want to support what we're doing in this podcast, I highly recommend that you share it or subscribe to whatever podcast app that you're using. And of course, if you promote this on social media, that helps us a lot. Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, anywhere that you're talking about the podcast, it's incredibly helpful for us. And you can also support us financially by buying Vertex products from the Vertex website or authorized dealers. Places like Sweetwater, Chicago Music Exchange are two of our great dealers that are in the U.S. And of course, we have others around the country. Another way you can support us is by going to therigdr.com, where we offer all the pedal board products that we use on every single rig, the zip ties, tie-down mounts. We make custom cables there with the same stuff that I use on all the rigs, so definitely go and check that out. We also have a Patreon page where you can actually become a supporting member. We have various ranges of membership from $4.99 a month up to $49.99 a month, where you can get exclusive content, one-on-one coaching with us. You can also be a part of our weekly live streams, which are private to our subscribing members and our paying members. So make sure that you check that out if you haven't already. And if you can't afford any of those memberships, you can always request a free account. We grant 100% of those requests for free accounts. So if you need a free account and you're interested in kind of learning more, having some private Q&A time as part of our live streams, or having some exclusive deals and discounts available to you, and can't afford the $4.99 a month, just send us an email at info@vertexeffects.com and we will give you a free account, no questions asked. And I want to give a big shout out to our sponsors, Blue Microphones, for sponsoring this, Diodario, who's not only sponsoring this, but also our live Q&As that we're doing every week, and True Tone as well for sponsoring and being a part of our live Q&As as well that we do as a part of our Patreon, but also just a part of being able to connect with our audience every week. At the end of a week of content, we kind of do a recap, and these are all part of our sponsorships, so we really appreciate them and all of their help. And I want to thank the people that make this podcast possible. Hunter Harrison, always, for editing and mixing this podcast, making everybody sound great. And Mason Mejia for co-producing, and Tim Marco for creating all of the music for this podcast. Until next time, I'm Mason Marangella, the Rig Doctor from Vertex Effects. I'll see you later.